There's a specific kind of person who says you really didn't have to every single time someone is kind to them. Not once. Every time. A compliment lands, and their body tenses before their mind even catches up. Someone remembers their coffee order, and they deflect it with a joke. Someone shows up for them without being asked, and instead of warmth, what rises first is suspicion, quiet, reflexive, almost automatic. They'll tell you they're fine. They'll insist they don't need help carrying the boxes, don't need a ride, don't need anyone to check in. And most of the time, they mean it, not because they're lying, but because somewhere along the way, needing anything from anyone started to feel like a liability they couldn't afford. Meanwhile, they're the first person everyone else calls. The one who remembers the birthdays, shows up at the hospital, drives across town at midnight without being asked twice. Deeply capable of loving other people well. Strangely unable to let it happen in reverse. Curious, isn't it, that the thing most of us say we want most, to be loved well, to be taken care of, is the exact thing certain people brace against like an incoming blow? And here's the question worth sitting with. What if the coldness you've noticed in someone, the way they change the subject when you compliment them, the way they insist on paying, on helping, on being the one who gives, isn't coldness at all? What if it's the most sophisticated defense system the human mind has ever built? Because that's simply what this is. A defense. And by the end of this, you're going to recognize exactly which version of it you carry. There's a first type worth naming immediately because it's the most visible one, and it's probably the one you thought of the second this video started. Call this person the deflector. The deflector doesn't reject love loudly. They reject it politely. A thank you, but a laugh that cuts a tender moment short, a subtle redirection back toward the other person. Okay, but how are you doing? Before anyone has time to sit in the discomfort of actually being seen. From the outside, it looks like modesty. It looks like someone who simply doesn't need much. But here's what's interesting. Modesty doesn't usually come with a racing heart. Researcher John Bowlby, working in London through the mid-20th century, was among the first to describe how early bonds with caregivers shape a person's relationship to closeness for the rest of their life. His work was extended by developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth, whose research through Johns Hopkins University identified what she called an avoidant attachment pattern, a style that develops in children who learn, long before they have language for it, that reaching for comfort doesn't reliably get met, and sometimes gets met with distance instead. Not always through cruelty. Often through a caregiver who is simply overwhelmed, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable in ways too subtle to name. So the child adapts, stops reaching, learns to meet their own needs quietly, efficiently, alone. And it works. It works so well that decades later, that same adaptation shows up as an adult who can run a household, manage a crisis, hold an entire team together, and still feels a jolt of panic when someone simply asks, "What do you need?" Because the nervous system never got the memo that the danger passed. It just knows that closeness once meant disappointment, and disappointment hurt more than distance ever did. That makes sense of something most people never say out loud, that receiving love can feel more exposing than receiving criticism. Criticism, at least, confirms what you already suspected about yourself. Love asks you to believe something new. And belief, for a nervous system trained on withdrawal, feels like walking onto ice that hasn't been tested yet. There's a difference between people who love you and people who need you. People who love you want to be around you, even when you have nothing to give. People who need you, you'll notice, are a lot harder to find when your hands are empty. If that distinction just landed somewhere in your chest, I go much deeper into it in what I've linked below, in the description, and in the first pinned comment. Now flip it, because the deflector isn't the only shape this takes, and the second type is quieter, harder to spot, and in some ways more exhausting to live inside. Call this one the preemptive giver. This is the person who, the moment they sense someone might do something kind for them, rushes to do something kind first. They pay before the check arrives. They send the thoughtful text before anyone sends one to them. They show up with a casserole, the ride to the airport, the thoughtful gift, always one step ahead of ever being on the receiving end. It looks generous. It is generous. But underneath the generosity is a quieter transaction most people never examine. Because if you give first, You never have to sit in the vulnerable position of hoping someone chooses to give to you. You control the exchange. You stay useful. And usefulness for this person has always... Psychologist Kristin Neff, whose research at the University of Texas at Austin helped establish the modern study of self-compassion, has described how many people build their entire sense of worth around what they produce or provide rather than around simply existing. Her work suggests that people who struggle to treat themselves with basic kindness often struggle just as much to accept kindness from others, because both require believing, on some level, that they deserve care without having to earn it first. And that's the quiet tragedy of the preemptive giver. They will move mountains for the people they love. And they will almost never let anyone move so much as a pebble for them. Ask this person to simply sit still and be helped. No reciprocation, no rush to even the score, and watch how physically uncomfortable it makes them. Watch how quickly they find something to do with their hands. It's not that they don't want to be cared for. It's that being cared for, without earning it, threatens a belief they've carried since childhood, that love is conditional, and the condition is usefulness. Because somewhere back there, being helpful was probably the safest role available. Maybe it was the peacekeeper role in a chaotic home. Maybe it was the responsible one in a family that couldn't afford another person falling apart. Little by little, without ever deciding to, they became the giver. And the giver, by definition, doesn't get to also be the one who needs. But then there's a third type, and this one is probably the most misunderstood of all because on the surface it doesn't look like avoidance at all. It looks like distrust. Call this person the skeptic. The skeptic can receive love, technically. They'll accept the gift, sit through the compliment, let someone take care of them for an evening. But there's always a part of them standing slightly outside the moment, waiting for the catch, waiting for the bill to come due, waiting to find out what this kindness is going to cost them later. They've trained themselves, often without realizing it, to treat warmth as a variable to be analyzed rather than a gift to be received. Clinical psychologist Sue Johnson, who developed emotionally focused therapy through decades of research into adult bonding, described how many people who experienced inconsistency or emotional unpredictability in earlier relationships develop a kind of protective vigilance around closeness, a part of them that stays braced even in moments that are objectively safe. Her work suggests this isn't a character flaw. It's an old survival strategy still running in a body that hasn't yet learned the danger is over. And here's the strangest part. The skeptic often ends up unconsciously testing the people who love them the most, pulling away slightly to see if the other person follows, staying quiet about a need to see if it gets noticed anyway. Not to sabotage the relationship. To gather evidence that it's real before they let themselves fully believe it. Which means the very love they're most afraid of losing is the love they end up making hardest to give them. And here's where many stories diverge, because it would be easy to stop here and call all of this a wound. But there's a nuance most people skip past, and it complicates the tidy narrative. Because the same hypervigilance that makes it hard to receive love is often exactly what made someone remarkably good at reading rooms, anticipating needs, sensing when something is wrong before anyone says a word. The deflector's independence built a person who can survive almost anything alone. The preemptive giver's generosity built relationships that genuinely benefited from their care. The skeptic's caution has, more than once, protected them from people who truly weren't safe to trust. So this isn't simply a flaw to erase. It's a strategy that made sense once, doing its job a little too well in a present that no longer requires it. And here's something else worth noticing. This pattern rarely shows up the same way in every relationship. The same person who can't accept a compliment from a parent might receive one easily from a stranger. The same person who deflects affection from a partner might soak up praise at work without blinking. Because it was never really about love in general. It was about specific people, specific histories, specific rooms where being vulnerable once went badly. The nervous system doesn't generalize the way we assume it does. It remembers exactly where the danger lived. And that's what most people never see about this pattern. It isn't that these people can't love. They love enormously, sometimes more than anyone around them realizes because so much of it gets funneled into giving instead of receiving. What they lack isn't capacity. It's the felt sense somewhere in the body that they're allowed to be on the receiving end without it costing them something. Because receiving requires a kind of surrender that giving never does. When you give, you stay in control. When you receive, you have to trust that the other person's care is real, sustainable, and not about to disappear the moment you stop being useful. For someone whose early world taught them that trust was risky, that surrender can feel more dangerous than any conflict ever could. I want to give you something before this video ends. Permission to be tired,
To not want to help right now.
to have a need and say it out loud, to take up space without earning it first. These are not radical things, but for some of us, they feel like they are. I've written about why and what slowly starts to change. Link in the description and in the first pinned comment. Now I need to ask you something directly because chances are somewhere in the last few minutes you recognized yourself. Which one were you? The one who deflects the compliment before it fully lands. The one who gives first so you never have to feel the vulnerability of being given to. The one who accepts the kindness but keeps a quiet ledger, waiting to see if it's really free. Maybe it was all three, depending on the day, depending on who's offering. And if that's true, here's the thing you need to hear before anything else. None of this makes you broken. It makes you someone who adapted brilliantly to circumstances that once required exactly this kind of protection. The version of you that flinches at closeness didn't fail at love. It succeeded at survival. But maybe the softer question isn't why you struggle to receive love. Maybe it's what would happen if, just once, you let someone care for you and didn't rush to even the score. Didn't deflect, didn't preempt, didn't quietly wait for the catch. What would it feel like to simply let it land? That's not a switch you flip in one evening. It's something that loosens little by little, usually in the presence of people patient enough to keep offering warmth even when you flinch at it, and, slowly, in the presence of your own willingness to stop treating care as a debt. It might start small. Letting someone finish a compliment without cutting it off. Letting a friend pay for coffee without immediately reaching for your wallet to even things out. Sitting with the discomfort of being asked, "What do you need?" and actually answering, instead of redirecting the question back to them. None of that fixes the deeper pattern overnight. But it teaches the nervous system, one small moment at a time, that closeness doesn't have to end the way it used to. Maybe that's really what separates people who eventually learn to receive love from people who spend a lifetime avoiding it. Not how much love was available to them, but whether, at some point, they became willing to believe they were allowed to keep it without paying it back immediately. I'd love to know which type you saw yourself in the most, the deflector, the preemptive giver, or the skeptic. Tell me in the comments because I read every single one, and this is exactly the kind of pattern that becomes easier to understand once you say it out loud to someone else who recognizes it too. If this found something true in you, consider staying. There's a lot more of this coming, the quieter patterns nobody names, the behaviors you've always had a word for, but never quite the right one. Subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Because the goal was never to teach you how to be loved. It was to help you notice that you already are, and that the only thing left standing between you and feeling it is a door you built a long time ago, for reasons that made sense then, and that you are now, finally, old enough to open.